Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes him pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's fact. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome to episode 273 of the Last Round Podcast. And no Danny Z today, he's away. But we have someone who's been covering the boxing game for nearly 30 years, Keith Idec. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So I'll touch on that. 2 years away from the big 3-0 of covering boxing.
Yeah, it's been, has it been that long? Wow. Yeah. Since late 1996 was the first boxing story that I wrote for the paper way back when. So yeah, for quite some time. Yeah.
What was the first story?
I guess I'm a glutton for punishment in some ways, you know.
What was the first story you wrote in 1996?
I wrote a story about a guy named Omar Shika. I don't know if you remember him. He was an American from Paterson, New Jersey. He was an alternate on the 1996 U.S. Olympic team that had Floyd Mayweather, Fernando Vargas, and a lot of other what turned out to be very good pros. He was an alternate on that team. He was a decorated amateur. Wound up fighting for four world super middleweight world titles 4 times, including the first time against Joe Calzaghe over in London, which I covered. I covered 4 of his title fights. I guess it was Berlin, London, Montreal, Las Vegas. Unfortunately went 0 for 4, but came close to beating Jeff Lacey in the last one. But he was a fun fighter. He was an all-action fighter, and in his opinion, didn't live up to the billing. He feels he was inducted into the New Jersey Boxing Hall of Fame last year, and Omar kind of feels like his career wasn't the success that it should have been, but he made a fair amount of money. He was managed by Bill Caton, who was, of course, Mike Tyson's manager once upon a time. So they invested a lot of money in him in the beginning of his career. And that was the first boxing story that I wrote, just that he was about to make his pro debut early in 1997. He was on TV a lot. That's when the USA Network had their series on Tuesday Night Fights. He fought a lot on that, and then wound up fighting on, ESPN, Showtime, and other places.
So Keith, if we retired you today, what 3 fights stand out that you attended?
Ooh, boy. Well, the best fight that I ever covered in person, the best action fight that I ever covered in person was Gatti Ward 1. Unfortunately, I was not at Corrales Castillo. I was not there. I was there the following week when Winky Wright fought Felix Trinidad, but I did not cover that fight from ringside. So Gatti Ward 1 would be the most memorable action fight that I've ever covered. That was May of 2002. Let me think. Just from the spectacle of it all, just Mayweather-Pacquiao, because it was such an unusual event. Of course, the whole world was watching that. It had been, festering for so long. And then when it finally happened, the fight itself, I wouldn't say was the most memorable fight we've ever seen. But we finally got to see the fight, and there was so much drama leading up to it the week of the fight. So many things happening outside of the ring, Michael, just not from a boxing perspective with Mayweather and Pacquiao. There were a lot of media controversies, people being credentialed to the fight. They had this huge media tent set up outside of MGM Grand, and it was an unusual week, an interesting week, and a hectic week for sure. So that one stands, and because it made, it generated about $600 million in overall revenue, which no fight has ever done before. So to be involved in something like that was something that I would never forget. And I know when I think about this later, I'm going to say, man, I should have told them this one, that one, and the other one. But just off the top of my head, those. Can I give you a press conference as one of the 3?
Yeah, I mean, that'd be interesting.
Because one thing I'll never forget for the rest of my life was covering the Mike Tyson Lennox Lewis press conference in New York. It was January of 2002 when Mike Tyson flipped out on the reporter and said all kinds of things that I probably shouldn't repeat on your podcast here. But he bit Lennox Lewis's leg, and that might not have been the worst thing that he did that day. So it was the craziest press conference I've ever been involved in. That's why when I covered the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson press conference a few weeks ago, people were saying, "Oh, do you expect it to be crazy?" Anything will pale in comparison to Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis. And I'll never forget the look. They were inviting people off the street because it was open to the public. So they were inviting and it was January, so it was very cold in Manhattan, and they were just inviting random tourists off the street to kind of fill the venue. I think it was called the Palladium Theater or something in Manhattan where they held the press conference. And I'll never forget, there just happened to be a couple from Minnesota that I had talked to a little bit before the press conference started, and they were kind of standing near me. And I just remember the horrified look they had on their faces when this whole thing started going down, and Mike Tyson was, yelling at grabbing his crotch and screaming all kinds of crazy stuff on the stage. And they just like turned around and left. They were like, what did we get involved in here? They were like 70-year-old people from Minnesota who probably just thought they were coming to some like normal thing. And it was anything but normal, that's for sure.
Who's the most intimidating person you've ever interviewed?
I would say Mike, because you never knew what he was going to do. And I mean this more so when he was at the peak of his career, because you never knew how he was going to react to a question. And at a moment's notice, he could be speaking in a normal tone, and then something could set him off, and you'd be worried that, not that he was going to hit you or anything, but that, you were going to incur his wrath to some degree. So probably Mike, because of all the volatility involved in his life and everything, and he was so unpredictable. He'd probably be the guy that was most intimidating to be around.
Do you have any favorite venues that you used to like to cover boxing?
The Blue Horizon in Philadelphia, which is closed now, unfortunately, but that was a fun place because the way that they had it set up, they had it kind of reminds me of a couple of venues I've seen on television from England. But it was a very cozy place. Fans were very close to the ring, and there were fans on the floor, and then they had like a balcony that surrounded the ring. And they didn't have air conditioning in there because it was a very old building. And a couple of the fights that I covered there in the late 90s and early 2000s were in the summer, and it was sweltering, not only for the fighters, but for, the media and everything. It was a bandbox for sure. And that was a very unique place that I enjoyed covering fights. And then, as a Yankees fan growing up, I've been a Yankees fan since I was a little kid, big baseball fan, to actually cover a fight on the outfield grass at Yankee Stadium, which I got the opportunity to do when Miguel Cotto fought Yuri Foreman. I think it was June of 2010. That was fun. I mean, to be able to sit out in the outfield and watch boxing matches was something you wouldn't forget either.
Is there any venues or any countries that you'd like to visit that you haven't had a chance so far?
To cover fights, you mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've been fortunate. I've covered fights in England. I've covered fights in Wales, Germany, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, of course, the US. I'd like to go to Japan. I'd like to cover a fight in Japan because I don't know what the atmosphere necessarily would be like, because as I'm sure you've seen, the fans, they don't tend to they certainly don't get as rowdy as your friends in the UK. That's for sure.
Right.
So, they seem to be much more polite, but I think they've had some great atmospheres for some of these Inoue fights, and I'd like to maybe go cover an Inoue fight in Japan if I got that opportunity.
Have you had chance, Keith, to cover? It's a good transition, I guess, in Saudi Arabia.
Not yet, no, because when I was with Boxing Scene for all that time, most of the travel was domestic travel. We did do some international, but we didn't make it over to any of the fights that were there with Boxing Scene. But moving forward, I think I'll definitely get over there sooner than later.
And are you for or against, the fights kind of, because they're taking the big fights really away from the US, away from the UK at the minute, over to Saudi. Are you a fan of that?
Well, in some ways you have to understand it because they're putting up the money. So if they're paying for the fights and they want the fights to be in Riyadh, well, the fights wouldn't be happening if they weren't paying for them. So you have to look at it from that perspective. But I think that from what I've heard from Turki Al-Sheikh is that he wants to he's of course bringing this very good fight card to LA to, I think it was, I forgot what it's called now, but it's an outdoor venue in LA, and that should be a pretty cool environment on August 3rd. And then they're bringing fights to London, I believe Wembley Stadium on September 21st. So they're branching out a little bit, and I think they're going to bring some of their bigger cards. I think maybe the biggest of big cards, the ones on which they spend the most money, still might come to Riyadh because there's a lot of, they want to see the fruits of their investment, I guess, right? They want it to benefit their economy. They want to be proud to be able to say, we're making this happen and we brought the fight to Riyadh. And I understand why people, if you're from let's just say you're from England and Anthony Joshua at some point winds up fighting Tyson Fury. Well, you want that fight at Wembley Stadium or Tottenham Hotspur Stadium or something like that. Of course, who wouldn't, right? Same goes for American fans. Like, let's just say Gervonta Davis winds up fighting Shakur Stevenson. You would want that fight in Las Vegas or a venue like that because that's where you would think it would belong. But again, if someone's putting up all of this money and in some cases enormous amounts of money, I guess who is anyone to tell them where the fight should be?
Yeah, he could essentially put it on a cruise ship just for himself to watch.
I mean, in some ways, people should have, and I don't mean they don't have the right to want it where they want it, but at the same time, I guess in some ways you should be appreciative of the fact that the fights are even happening because Beterbiev Bivol was a fight we wanted to see for how long, and for a variety of reasons, they could not make it happen. They just couldn't. And then Turki Al-Sheikh comes along and has a conversation with Beterbiev, has a conversation with Bivol, with Eddie Hearn, with Bob Arum, with everyone involved, and now the fight's happening. So ideally, that fight for them anyway would be in Russia because that's where Beterbiev is from and that's where Bivol has lived for a long time. It can't be in Russia now for obvious reasons. So it's in Riyadh. But the guy made the fight happen. It looked like we were never going to see it because Beterbiev keeps getting older, and of course, we all get older, but I mean, he's pushing 40 years old now, and Bivol is significantly younger than him, but this guy came along and it looks like we're going to see the fight in October. So let's hope that they both stay healthy and we finally get to see it.
From what you've heard, Keith, do you think Turki Al-Sheikh will be around for some time?
I get that sense. I mean, he really loves boxing. I've actually listened to a lot of his interviews where I was sort of surprised that he had the in-depth knowledge of the sport that he actually has. I mean, because in the beginning, we weren't all that familiar with him and we didn't know, is he a peripheral boxing fan? I mean, he said that he loved boxing and that would appear to be true. I mean, he knows the history of the sport. And if he can continue and the General Entertainment Authority of Saudi Arabia can continue to make fights happen that would not otherwise happen, I don't see why people would not want the Saudis to be involved in the sport.
No, it's true. It's true. Well, diving into that card, Saturday, the 1st of June from the Kingdom Arena, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia on DAZN pay-per-view. Zhilei Zhang moved to 27-2-1 with a TKO 5 over Deontay Wilder, who dropped to 43-4-1. So, Keith, going into this, I think a lot of people probably thought that Deontay Wilder looked a little bit washed from his last performance against Parker, and we were wondering, is he going to be able to find that fire? Is he going to be able to get back to the old Deontay Wilder and, the one-punch killer? It didn't seem so. Do you think that's the last we've seen of him?
I hope so. Because Deontay Wilder's made a lot of money, of course, has a lot of children to care for, but he's made a lot of money, and as far as I've been led to believe, he's done well with his money. So if he sticks around, it's going to be for a lot lesser purses than he has become accustomed to making, even after losing to Joseph Parker. He's made good money for these last two fights, but you can't keep getting, or he didn't get knocked out by Joseph Parker, but he lost decisively, and then he gets violently knocked out by Zhilei Zhang. So I don't see him going through the grueling training camps and everything at his advanced age. He's a 30, I believe Deontay's 38 now, going on 39. So I don't think he'll put himself through that anymore, for lesser purses and lesser fights. Not saying he deserves more than that at this point because he continues to lose, but I think we've seen the last of him in a boxing ring. And his story, we all have our faults with how Deontay handled his loss to Tyson Fury. None of us were really happy about all the conspiracy theories and the way that he kind of turned on everyone for whatever he believes happened that night. That'll be a black mark on his record, unfortunately, because he did not handle that with any kind of class or dignity. But his story is rather incredible, Michael, in that where he came from and he started boxing so late, and frankly, his technique is terrible. Yet he was can't miss TV, because at a moment's notice he could change a fight. The second Luis Ortiz fight, he's losing every round of the fight, and then he detonates one of those right hands, and then it's a wrap for Luis Ortiz, and that's what made him so fun to watch. He was electrifying, and when you could sense it in the building, because I covered most of his fights from ringside, certainly his highest level fights I've covered from ringside, and you could sense in the building the anticipation, because people knew that, again, he could just violently knock someone out when it looked like he was on his way to losing a particular fight.
Do you think he left a little piece of himself in the ring with those 3 fights with Tyson Fury?
Yeah, especially the third one, because, I think more than anything, yes, physically he probably left some of himself in the ring, as you mentioned, but also his psyche was irrevocably damaged as well, because he was used to knocking people out the way that Tyson Fury knocked him out. He has a million excuses for why he lost this fight or that fight. So he had convinced himself that he didn't really lose that night. He couldn't convince himself otherwise based on what happened in their third fight. He was viciously knocked out. No two ways about it. Now, he almost won that fight because he knocked Tyson Fury down twice in the 4th round, and seemed like he would get his revenge against Tyson Fury, which most people probably didn't see coming going into that third fight. But I think his psyche was forever damaged by that fight. I think that reflected in the way that he fought against Joseph Parker, because to me, over the course of those 12 rounds, it looked like he was reluctant to engage. I don't know if you felt the same way, but it looked to me, and I don't want to say he was afraid to get hit. He's a professional boxer. Of course, you're going to get hit. But he looked like he was a little gun shy. And although Joseph Parker isn't the biggest puncher in the heavyweight division, he is 6'4", 250 pounds or whatever. He can crack a little bit. So I think he just didn't want to go for it in that fight, because he was worried about what was coming back at him. And I think he was just looking to get through 12 rounds and get out of there that night. I thought he was a little more of a willing participant on Saturday night. He threw some right hands, and he knew that he was going to have to try to keep a big, strong guy like Zhilei Zhang off of him. And he did his best to do that for 4+ rounds. But ultimately, Zhang was too much.
Do you think the change in trainer was also a bit of a missed trick, because it looks like Malik Scott just trying to get him to box, where, like we both touched on, his technique is awful, where everything is about setting up just that right hand.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why Malik tried to do the things that he tried to do with Deontay. He was trying to correct a decade and a half of mistakes. And ultimately, I guess you would say that he failed at that based on his record with Malik Scott. But Malik was with him before, of course, as an assistant trainer. And I look, there's no way to look at it as a success, because he didn't win. He won 1 fight with Malik in his corner, unfortunately. So, and that was a first round knockout against Robert Helenius. We didn't get to see much of him in that fight, but he did what Deontay Wilder had always done. He violently knocked someone out and gave fans what they wanted to see to some degree. But yeah, I don't know. Because Malik, the thing is, Malik was not his head trainer, but he had a lot of success with Malik being in his camp. They were sparring partners once upon a time. Of course, they fought. So he had something to do with Deontay winning a lot of fights as well. He just wasn't his head trainer at that time. But yeah, I mean, it would be hard to point to the change in trainers and say that it was a success once you look at it from hindsight.
I think Deontay's overrated, underrated.
No, I don't think he's overrated, because I think most people have always said he's he's one of the most fundamentally flawed fighters we've ever seen. Yet he's got this pulverizing power that makes him a threat to knock you out at any point in a fight. Even a point, even a fight he's down, 8-2 or something like that. He was always a threat to knock someone out. So I don't think so. Because I don't think a lot of people, maybe once upon a time before he got steamrolled by Tyson Fury in the second fight and then got violently knocked out in the third fight, there might have been a time before that where people were overvaluing him a little bit and maybe putting him historically in a place in which he didn't belong. But I think most people kind of see him for what he was. And he was a fun fighter. He made a lot of money, generational type of wealth. He can take care of his family very comfortably now. So when you go back and look at it, I mean, he was a success, a huge success in that way. I mean, he came, the guy was working at a restaurant in Alabama, for God's sake, before he started boxing. And then he goes to become heavyweight champion of the world. And of course, we have this 4-belt system, which is completely stupid, I think, as we would all agree. But he was, he held the world title for over 5 years. I mean, that's not easy to do, no matter who you were fighting. And I've heard the argument, there's no way he's a Hall of Famer and all this kind of, look, the Boxing Hall of Fame, I would remind people, is not exactly the Baseball Hall of Fame. So there are people in there that I think a lot of people would argue don't belong in there, fighters, I mean. So I don't know, you'd have to see who's on the ballot at the same time and everything, but he won a lot of big fights, or he won a lot of heavyweight title fights, right? And people make this argument for Arturo Gatti, right? Arturo Gatti is in the Hall of Fame. There are a lot of people who think that Arturo Gatti does not belong in the Hall of Fame. Would you say that Arturo Gatti accomplished more in his career than Deontay Wilder? He did win world titles in multiple weight classes, but he had a lot more losses. And while he was a huge star here in New Jersey and did huge numbers on HBO and is a beloved fighter, and I really enjoyed covering Arturo's career and remember it fondly. But I don't know that he was more successful than Deontay Wilder.
It's true. It's true. Looking at Zhang, what a 2 years he's had from the loss to Hrgovic, which I thought he won, to be honest with you. 2 fights with Joe Joyce, majority decision against Joseph Parker, and then beating Deontay Wilder.
Been a nice little run here, hasn't it? This story is a little personal for me, Michael, in the sense that I've been covering Zhilei Zhang since he came here from China in 2014. At the time, he was promoted by a company run by Dino Duva, who, of course, was one of Lou Duva's sons. And I was very close to Lou and Dino as well. And Lou always told me, that this guy was going to be a heavyweight. And when they had the initial press conference to introduce him, Meng Fanlong, who became a light heavyweight contender, and 2 other Chinese fighters that they had under contract from the Olympic team in 2012, Evander Holyfield was at the opening press conference and was singing Zhilei Zhang's praises and saying that he would be a heavyweight champion of the world at some point based on what he had seen. And of course, a lot of what Lou had told him. Lou was a great promoter. Lou passed away in 2017, and every time Zhilei fights, before the fight, during the fight, I always think of Lou and how happy he would be to see Zhilei Zhang finally, and I mean finally, because it looked like it was not going to happen for quite some time. He's finally realizing the potential that Lou and a lot of other people saw in him. He's 41 years old. It's a pretty remarkable story, and that, and even though heavyweights fight longer than fighters in other weight classes most times, they're usually done at the top level by 41 years old. So it's pretty incredible what he's been able to do. And like you said, he's knocked out Joe Joyce twice. I think he definitely lost to Joseph Parker, but he did knock him down twice and had him in some trouble. And now he viciously knocks out who was a long reigning heavyweight champion and a guy who a lot of people thought might knock him out in a pay-per-view main event. So he's trained, Zhilei Zhang is trained by Sean George, who is married to Lou Duva's granddaughter. He's been his trainer for a long time. So he trains him here in Paterson, New Jersey, which is about, 20 minutes from where I live. So it's been a fun story to watch. It's been gratifying in the sense that he's finally fulfilling his potential.
When you say finally, Keith, is that just because he couldn't get the right fights, or?
Well, a lot of it was self-inflicted, Michael, in that, he didn't always train the way he needed to train to thrive at the elite level. He always had the skill set and the boxing brain because he's a very smart guy. You can see by the way he sets up punches. Um, didn't always train the right way, I guess, and they had strength and conditioning coaches along the way. I just don't think that he put his heart and soul into it sometimes. He's certainly started to do that a lot more over the last few years, realizing that he was running out of time to, make real money and realize some of his potential. He used to smoke cigarettes, which I found fascinating. Like professional athlete smoking cigarettes was kind of crazy, I thought. But so he's really cleaned that up, and he lives in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Now, his family still lives in China. He basically lives by himself here in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and boxing is his whole life now. So, he's got some friends, of course, and Meng Fan, long before he returned to China permanently, was his roommate. They lived together in an apartment in Bloomfield, which is also just a couple towns away from where I live. But he's really focused, and he's won some big fights here, and now he's in position where he's in the mix to. I think that Anthony Joshua is going to fight Daniel Dubois next. Understandably so. It's a bigger fight in the UK. But Zhang actually lost to Joshua at the 2012 Summer Olympics in London. And he's been, when I say calling out, I don't know who's actually heard it, but he's been calling out Joshua for quite some time, saying that he wants his rematch. He wants his shot at Joshua. Joshua, of course, has resurrected his career. Maybe if he goes and beats Dubois in September, I could see maybe, Zhang getting a chance at the, if he has some version of the title or whatever at that point, getting a chance at that. But he's at the very least, he set himself up for another big payday. And I don't think, based on what happened in February of 2021 when he fought Jerry Forrest, and just he was completely depleted and looked like he wasn't going to be able to function as a heavyweight boxer anymore, because he was so dead tired by the midway point of that fight. I don't think anyone foresaw from that night that he was going to be able to do anything close to what he has done in the 3 subsequent years.
I think we could see a Zhang AJ over in China.
He wants to fight in China, and his people have really explored the possibility of that happening because the 1.4 billion people or so, and maybe it might be more than that, might be 1.6 billion, whatever it is. There are a lot more people in China than any other country in the world. And I wouldn't say for the most part that they're huge boxing fans, but they are huge fans of Chinese athletes, no matter what those athletes are doing. So they made his fight available on his last few fights have been made available in China on some sort of app. And they've gotten a pretty good response from it, despite that the fights are on live in the wee hours of the morning. It's very cheap. It might be $1 or $2 in American money to buy the fights over there, but they're definitely exploring it. It's something that they'd like to do. Would AJ go to China to fight Zhilei Zhang? I would say no, because AJ's the A side and he can dictate wherever the fight is. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, there's always a possibility the fight could be in Riyadh. But those would be the 2 places, if they were to eventually fight, where I expect the fight to be. It would either be in London or Riyadh. But they would do well from a business standpoint if it's not against AJ, even against a lesser opponent. If Zhang he has fought in China before earlier in his career, but in much lower level fights, just kind of stay busy fights and that kind of thing. But if he returns there and fights in what would be considered a marquee event, they'll make a lot of money, and I know it would mean a lot for him in terms of his legacy.
I'm assuming if he does fight AJ and it's for the IBF, first heavyweight world champion from China.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, do you count the interim WBO belt because he did win that from Joe Joyce? I know he was only an interim champion, but I guess technically maybe he's first Chinese heavyweight champion already, but yeah, it would much more validate him if he owned.
Sorry, lost you for a second there.
Yeah, I lost you for a couple seconds there. I don't know what you.
Moving on to Dimitri Bivol against Malik Zineid, I think is how you pronounce it. TKO 6 for the IBO and WBA light heavyweight championships of the world. Obviously, this was supposed to be the big fight we were all looking forward to, the undisputed fight against Beterbiev. That was called off due to injury, moved to October, I think you said earlier, Keith. So not a bad standing. I never heard of Malik Zineid before. I had no idea who he was. Seemed to have a pretty padded, soft record, but I thought he made a good show of it.
Yeah, he came to fight at least, right? I mean, he made it interesting for a few rounds. It was good that Bivol got in some rounds before he goes into this fight with Beterbiev, so he didn't have to just, sit around and wait. It was good to see him get a knockout for the first time in over 6 years. I was actually there the night that he had his last knockout. It was at the theater at Madison Square Garden against Sullivan Barrera. That was March of 2018. He unfortunately for him, he only fought 9 times because he's battled inactivity over the last few years, but 9 fights in a row went to 12-round distance, and it had just gotten to the point where as great of a fighter as he is, which we saw when he beat Canelo Alvarez, it was becoming a little tedious, maybe more than a little tedious. So it was good to see him stop someone, generate some buzz as we get toward the Beterbiev fight. And I think people are, really, really anticipating this fight because we wanted to see it for so long.
I do wonder, before I was going to pick Beterbiev, but over the last few fights, we seem to be seeing Beterbiev kind of deteriorating physically, because there's been a few fights where he's had to delay them due to injury. And I've heard some rumors from camp that he seems to be kind of like falling apart physically, I guess, from, non-stop training and the amateur career, then the professional career. So how do you see that one before?
Yeah, before he fought Callum Smith, I would have said the same thing, because he's had so many injuries, and it's various injuries, right? It was his elbow, his shoulder, his knee, his this, his that. There's always something different going wrong with him, unfortunately, a lot of it from the rigors of training, as you said. But he looks so good against Callum Smith. And Callum Smith, is, as you know, is a very good fighter. I mean, he's a top level fighter, and no one had done that to him, including Canelo Alvarez. That just had not happened to him. And I think Callum Smith and his brothers and the whole Smith clan, they were very surprised that Beterbiev was able to do that to him the way that he did. And that was one of his most impressive wins, as far as I could tell. I mean, Callum Smith is a real guy. Didn't look great against Canelo, but he took that fight on, for all intents and purposes, 4 weeks notice for the payday. So I don't know what to make of that in some ways, but although he doesn't make any excuses about it, he took the money, so he's got the consequences. But no one had ever seen. My point is that no one had ever seen that happen to Callum Smith before, and Beterbiev is older now. I mean, he's almost 40 years old. So to see him do that the way that he did against Callum Smith really makes me optimistic about the type of fight that we'll see when he fights Bivol.
Fingers crossed. I hope so, because I wouldn't want to wait that long, and then we get in there, and then after a couple of rounds we just see like, okay, well, Beterbiev's kind of washed, and this is kind of like a cash out.
Let's hope not. I mean, there was, look, all we can do is base it off of his last fight, right? I guess he got hurt again. So like you said, he's always getting hurt. But based on what I saw in those 7 rounds or so against Callum Smith, I don't have any reason to believe that would happen. But as they always say, Michael, we've heard this a million times, right? There is going to be that night for Artur Beterbiev and everyone else when you just get old.
Yes, that is true. Sadly, that is true.
Yeah.
Nick Ball next up, 20-0, split decision win over Raymond Ford, who dropped to 15-1-1. Scorecards of 115-113 twice and 113-115 for Raymond Ford. This was for the WBA Featherweight World Championship. Beforehand, I thought this was going to be a good clash of styles. Ford more of the boxer, Nick Ball kind of like a mini Mike Tyson, comes in, pressure, punches, uppercuts. How much did you know of Nick Ball, Keith, before this fight, with him being mainly in the UK?
Yeah, I'd seen his last few fights. Of course, the Ray Vargas fight, I thought he won. I thought he got, I don't know if robbed is the right word, but I thought he deserved to win. I thought he should have come into this fight as a featherweight champion. I mean, I thought he beat Ray Vargas, and I saw him fight the previous year. I'm trying to remember. I think it was when Michael Conlan fought. he had a really good win on an undercard that I saw on ESPN Plus last year. So I was familiar with his style, his pressure style and his relentlessness. And what is he, 5'2" for God's sake? I mean, it's amazing that he's able to get out of it what he does. He's a tough dude, man. And I thought he beat Ray Ford, but I give Ray Ford a lot of credit because it looked like Nick Ball was going to just overwhelm him at a certain point. And Ray Ford is a really tough kid from Camden, New Jersey. And for those people not familiar with Camden, New Jersey, that is not the type of place you want to grow up. And that is where Raymond Ford grew up. So you survive that place, you could pretty much survive anything. And you're inherently tough coming out of that. So I wasn't surprised that he pushed back because that's what he did in the previous fight to win the title. I mean, he was losing on 2 of the 3 scorecards before he got the knockout in the 12th round. He's a talented kid. There are people who think he should have had a couple of losses on his record already based on some of his previous fights, but he's got some ability and he's got a lot of heart. But I did think that Nick Ball beat him, and I was happy to see Ball get the decision based on what happened in the Vargas fight 3 months ago. I'd love to see them fight again, but it does seem like Ray Ford is going to move up to 130 pounds. He stuck around at 126 because they were both paid a lot of money. And credit to him because after the fight, he said, a lot of times, Michael, in these close fights, we always, we see guys saying they're robbed and this is an injustice and the judges will rob me and the promoters and all this stuff. Ray Ford said, look, I thought I won. Nick Ball was the better man tonight. Maybe we'll fight again at some point. I'll probably move up to 130 pounds. Congratulations to him. I thought he handled it very well.
That was literally going to be the next thing I was going to say. I was just about to say I thought he was very respectful afterwards, which in this day and age, a lot of people don't seem to be. There's always so many different excuses of why they lost. And, like Deontay Wilder is probably the most famous example when he came out with all the different, the gloves excuse, the ring attire excuse and stuff like that. So, yeah, I thought it was very respectful.
Yeah. I was sitting in this very seat here in my home office when Deontay Wilder told me that story about I guess we call it a costume at this point, but it was 2 days after, it was the Monday after that fight. And he had done like 3 or 4 interviews in a row. I was maybe second or third. I think Lance Pugmire, my colleague, was one of them, Kevin Ioli. There was like 3 or 4 of us that did the interviews, and he told all of us the same story. And I just kind of remember, like, am I hearing this correctly? Like, what? The costume was too heavy, so, I don't want to pile on Deontay at the lowest point of his career here, but that's something that he's not going to be remembered favorably for. But again, I think he deserves a lot of credit from where he started and where the pinnacle that he reached in his career.
Yeah, 100%. With Raymond Ford moving up, do you think we could see him matched with O'Shaquie Foster?
That'd be an interesting fight, wouldn't it? Yeah, and I'd love to see that fight. I think, and now, you have, I don't think we're all going to get these 5v5 type of cards all the time, but maybe with some mixing and matching and with, some of the Saudi money that's available now, maybe we'll see more of that because O'Shaquie Foster is with Top Rank now and Ray Ford is with Matchroom. So, although they've done business together, they've had guys fight on DAZN, guys fight on ESPN. So, that's an interesting fight though. And I think, he'll probably be better served not squeezing his body down to 126 pounds as he gets older here. But he didn't make as you said, he didn't make any excuses. He didn't say, 126 was too low for me, that I was depleted. He didn't say any of that. He needs to move up, but he didn't use the weight as an excuse. He gave Nick Ball his credit, and that was nice. The fight was entertaining. It was competitive, and the sportsmanship that was showed afterward was commendable.
One of my fights of the night, Hamza Shiraz moved to 20-0 again with a TKO 11 over Austin Amo Williams, who dropped to 16-1. This was for a WBC trinket, the WBC Silver Middleweight Championship. A great performance. I thought a breakout performance, honestly, from Hamza Shiraz. I thought he had a good win last time out against Liam Williams over in the UK. And then this one, because Amo Williams was kind of pushed quite a lot by Matchroom USA. So I thought it's a good win for Shiraz to kind of jump out onto the screens in the US.
And kudos to both guys for taking this type of fight because they could have gone in different directions and eventually built themselves probably sooner than later into world title contenders. I mean, they're obviously ranked already anyway, but they could have gotten a title shot without fighting each other. And now Ammo Williams has to build himself back up. But Shiraz looked fantastic in the fight. I think he showed a lot. I believe it was in the third round when Ammo Williams hurt him. He showed a lot by coming back because it was relatively early in the round when he got clipped with that punch that buzzed him a little bit. So he showed some resolve. He showed how he could handle adversity. And then for the most part, he just took complete control of the fight until it was finally stopped. He separated himself from a guy who was very highly thought of by Eddie Hearn and a lot of other people in boxing. So it was a great win for Shiraz. And I'm looking forward to seeing him, getting a title shot either later this year or early next year.
What do you think of the link-up, Keith, with Ricky Funes?
Yeah, interesting, right? I mean, and it worked out, right? I mean, it's hard to argue with it, right?
Yeah, I actually saw Hamza Shiraz last year. I was going to England to see my family, and he was at the airport. He was flying to London ready for the press conference. So I actually asked him, I was like, hey, how did you end up with Ricky Funes? That's so random. You're from the UK.
Yeah.
And he said that he was in a gym in the UK and Ricky was there and he took him on some pads. And he said he just liked the pad work. He liked the way that Ricky thought. So he came over to Van Nuys, tried it out for a bit, and then he's been there ever since.
Yeah, because he's trained in LA in the LA area for the most part now.
Yeah, they train out of Guzen's gym.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's an unusual pairing, but it's worked out, right?
Yeah, just because Ricky had been kind of like off the scene for a while, some youngsters and stuff like that, but not anyone as big and like a TV fighter, like Hamza Shiraz. So yeah, it's just funny to see him, and I always wondered. And then I saw him at the airport, and I was like, I'm going to ask him, how did you end up in that pairing? A guy from the UK and Ricky Funes, who's not massively well known. It's not like he ended up at Freddie Roach's gym, Wildcard or somewhere like that.
Yeah, no, that's true. Especially if you're gonna be in Southern California in some way, you'd figure you'd wind up with Freddie or, Manny Robles or one of the more well-known trainers. Joe, of course, Joe Goosen, one of those trainers.
Yeah. Looking at the middleweight division, Keith, you think? I know they've already spoken about Hamza Shiraz against Chris Eubank Jr.
The thing is, if there's enough money in it for Chris Eubank Jr. to do it, then he might do it, right? But otherwise, there's a lot of risk, and there better be some reward there for him to move forward with that fight. It would obviously be a big fight in the UK, but they have to make it worth Chris Eubank's while because he's the known fighter, he's the aged fighter, risking a lot by taking that type of fight. So I don't know. There probably is enough money in it for him to do it, if I had to guess, right? I mean, boxing obviously is more popular in the UK than it is in the US, and there's a lot of money being thrown around by people we've already mentioned on the podcast. So maybe it's more possible than I'm realizing, but but they just have to make it worth his while. But the other thing with Eubank is, does Eubank, what is he, 34 now? He's in his mid-30s, right? So is that what he wants? A young guy like that, Yeah,
because if you look at Chris Eubank's career, it always seems to be it's about money. So I was kind of surprised that, I don't know whether he took the high road by turning down the fight with Conor Benn after Conor Benn obviously tested positive. They still tried to put it on, and it looked like they were probably going to do it either over here in the US or maybe in Saudi. But he wouldn't take it, and I was kind of surprised by that because he always seems to be, he's just after the largest pot of money that he can get. And there's nothing wrong with that. He's a gladiator. He's a paid fighter.
That's why they call it prize fighting, right? Yeah, I don't blame him for that, but you're right about that, because I remember Eddie Hearn saying at some point within the last few months, like, he just was baffled by Eubank continuing to turn down that fight, because according to what Eddie was saying, I don't know if he was embellishing a little bit, but he was saying something like Eubank would make 3 times as much for the Conor Benn fight than he has made for any other fight. If that's true, it is really, really surprising. That I still think at some point, partially because of what you just said about who doesn't like money, right? Who doesn't want to maximize their pay? I haven't given up on that fight yet. I still, it's not like I'm, worried about it happening or anything, but I still think that fight very well could happen at some point. Do you?
I think so, because like you said, money talks. If anything, it's kind of just made Conor Benn into more of a heel, and Chris Eubank Jr. surprisingly is like, he's the good guy for once in his life. And I think for fans, it would still sell. And you could use that kind of like how the UFC did with the Conor McGregor and Khabib thing when he threw the big trolley at the bus and it smashed the thing. They used that to sell the fight, that actual piece of video they used to sell the fight. So it's kind of turning it into, WWE by making, the good guy and the bad guy. But that sells. The WWE use that for a reason, and boxing use it for a reason. So I think, that fight's always there in the back burner. Eventually, if Conor Benn gets a big fight, loses, they can still come back to that and revisit that later down the line. It'll still sell in the UK because the Kell Brook Amir Khan was about 7 years later than it should have been, but it still did decent numbers.
That's very true, Michael. And the thing for Conor Benn is that he also would make more money for that fight than he could make for any other fight because it would be such a big deal in the UK. And frankly, if he stays at welterweight, I know he fluctuates in weight a little bit, but let's just say he tries to get one of the top. I've heard people mention him fighting Jaron Ennis. That might be the end of Conor Benn's career if he fights Jaron Ennis. So put him in the ring with a guy he might have some chance to beat. Now, I realize that Chris Eubank is much bigger than him and probably won't bend on the weight because of what he's had to go through, all the stuff that Conor Benn has caused, all the trouble that Conor Benn has caused. He might not acquiesce to any kind of catch weight or something, so he'd have to go up a lot in weight. But, if he gets in there, Conor Benn's called out a lot of guys. I get it. I mean, that's the business. I understand why guys do that, but he shouldn't be fighting guys like Jaron Ennis and certainly not Terrence Crawford or someone like that, because those are fights he just can't win.
Turning our attention back to Shiraz, he picked up the WBC silver, the WBC interim champion right now, Carlos Adames. How do you see that matchup?
Adames is an interesting guy because it looked like he was not going to realize his potential for quite some time. And then he started taking training more seriously, and Bob Santos trains him now and has really had him focused. He hasn't fought in a while now, but he's looked pretty good since Bob Santos has had him. The Julian Williams performance wasn't quite as good as his previous performance, but I'd like to see that fight, though. That's one of the more interesting fights in the division because there's not much left in the middleweight division at this point, right? Because I don't know if we'll ever see Jamal Charlo fight again, let alone the middleweight division. Golovkin's retired. Janibek is fighting one obscure contender after another. It seems like Dingham and guys like that. I mean, I don't know what that's accomplishing really. So Janibek's an interesting guy, though. He can fight. So maybe that's another fight for him. But yeah, the Adames fight would be interesting. And I don't know, guys like Adames who are affiliated with the PBC, but not the how you can get to go fight on other cards, especially when someone else is going to pay the purses because they don't have the dates that they had when PBC was affiliated with Showtime and they were doing Showtime Championship boxing cards virtual. They don't have those dates available now, and they've done exclusively pay-per-view cards here since they launched the part thing on the schedule for to be streamed on Prime Video without paying extra for it. So a guy like Adames, I think, could be lured elsewhere to fight someone else. So why not, have Shiraz's promoter bring him over,
Moving on to Daniel.
Have Frank bring him over to someone else.
Exactly, yeah. Moving over to Daniel Dubois, who moved to 21-2 with a TKO 8 over Filip Hrgovic, who dropped to 17-1. This was for the IBF Interim Heavyweight Championship of the World. So, Keith, what did you think of Dubois' performance?
Man, how could you not be impressed by what Daniel Dubois did on Saturday, right? I mean, people have left him for dead how many times now? People think that he quit against Joe Joyce. He rebuilds himself, gets back into the position, gets a world title shot against Usyk. Depending on who you ask, that was a low blow or it wasn't a low blow. There are people who will tell you that they think Daniel Dubois should have left the ring with Usyk's titles in the 5th round, that Usyk sold what was not really a low blow to give himself the time to recuperate. I don't know. I mean, the only person who knows that with any certainty is Alexander Usyk, I suppose. But then Dubois kind of folded after that. He had an opportunity to capitalize on the momentum he had in that fight. And I thought from a mental and physical standpoint, he kind of folded against Usyk. But then he gets into this fight, and he's against a guy who can really punch, a guy who clearly underestimated him, not only before the fight, but I thought during the fight. I thought that Hrgović really approached this fight before and during it with an arrogance that really cost him on Saturday, because he just thought he was going to run through Daniel Dubois and make him quit. And there was no quit in Daniel Dubois the other night. And he really reinvigorated his career, put himself in a great position to potentially fight Anthony Joshua next. And you got to give that guy a lot of credit, because you know as well as anyone, Michael, what the word was about him in the UK in particular after that Joe Joyce fight that happened during the pandemic. I mean, people, they turned on Daniel Dubois. They said he would never amount to anything. And now, as still a relatively young guy, he's in a position to make a lot of money. And who knows when these big heavyweights start hammering away at each other? Who knows what's going to happen? You'd, of course, favor Joshua to win the fight. But who knows? No one thought Daniel Dubois would be here, so.
He's a quitter, Keith. He's a quitter.
Well, that quitter has acquitted himself pretty well, hasn't he?
No, he has, yeah. Obviously, change of trainer as well. I did wonder leaving a trainer that I rate in, like, McGuigan, and then moving over to Don Charles, who probably most famously was the coach of, Derek Chisora on and off several times. Mm-hmm. I did wonder how that was going to match up. But I thought he started off a little bit slowly against Hrgović, and then it seems to be maybe a little bit of, belief, because it looked like it took him a couple of rounds to kind of warm up or kind of get rid of those nerves. And then when he became kind of settled, I thought he moved a lot cleaner. There was a little bit more head movement. It looked like he started to believe, like, I can actually do this.
Yep. No, and once that belief set in, I mean, he just laid it on Hrgović. He had a couple of cuts, and I think if the fight wasn't stopped on cuts, I think Hrgović is a very tough guy with a great chin, but I think he would have eventually stopped him in a more conventional way if the fight went a couple more rounds.
And like you said, Daniel Dubois, he's 26, and for like a heavyweight, that's a baby.
Yeah, no, because I think people forget how young he was on the way up. And Frank was put him in real fights at such a tender age. And I'm not blaming Frank for that. He made a lot of money and he wanted to take those risks. But yeah, he was maybe in over his head a little bit too soon. Joe at that time when they fought, Joe was kind of looked at as like this a guy who could not be knocked out. He wasn't the best defensive fighter in the world, as we all saw for quite some time, but it looked like he had a granite chin and he never stopped throwing punches, and he was just a guy you weren't going to get out of there. So maybe that was too much for him too soon, but I'm assuming learned a lot from that fight about himself. And probably learned a lot from the Usyk fight as well. I'm sure he has a lot of regrets about what happened after the 5th round in that fight. And even as a young guy, he probably had to think, Michael, at some point, how many opportunities am I going to get? Like I lost to Joe Joyce. I got my title shot against the guy who holds, 3 or, depending if you count the IBO or whatever, he has 4 titles. He lost. If he would have lost to Hrgović, then he's just a guy, right? I mean, he's just I'm not saying he's an opponent, because he still has a name and he can punch and all that kind of stuff, but he's not going to be making huge paydays. And there's, of course, nothing close to what he'll make for fighting Anthony Joshua. So I think he felt some pressure, I'm sure, that his back was against the wall, even though, as you said, he's only 26 years old. He had to win this fight, and he went and fought like it.
Are you a fan of essentially the IBF sticking to their rules and, creating, the interim or, stripping Usyk? Because I know that, because obviously there's the undisputed fight, we're all like, oh, just let Usyk and Tyson fight once, or just let them fight again. But then we complain on the other hand when other people do it, when it's just for a normal title, say, not the undisputed, because essentially the IBF are just sticking to their rules by letting, Hrgovic and Danny Dubois fight it out.
I have no problem with them sticking to their rules. I mean, I wish the other sanctioning organizations did it and weren't so wishy-washy or manipulative about what they do. The only thing is they said they had, to the best of my knowledge, they had told the camps of Dubois and Hrgovic that they were going to fight for the IBF title, not the interim title, but the IBF title, and that they were going to let Fury and Usyk fight for the undisputed. And then after that fight, they were going to strip the winner and they would fight according to their rules that Dubois and Hrgovic would fight for the vacant IBF title. I don't know what changed from the time when they were told that until last week. They made it for the interim title. So they followed their rules to a lesser degree than they led us to believe that they would. So I don't know what to make of that exactly, but in the past they have stripped, they stripped Tyson Fury after he beat Vladimir Klitschko. They stripped Gennady Golovkin and a lot of other fighters who did not do what they wanted. I don't know if Canelo is going to voluntarily give up the IBF title or he'll be stripped, but he's certainly not going to fight William Skull, who was somehow the mandatory challenger for his IBF super middleweight title. So I'd like to commend the IBF in some ways because they do adhere to their rules. And like you said, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, you're not sticking to your rules. You guys are full of it. And then when they stick to their rules, say, oh, well, they should just let them go fight for the title. The other thing that I would say, though, is that anyone with any sense knows that the winner of the Fury-Usyk fight is the undisputed heavyweight champion. Case closed. So it's not like Joshua or Dubois could come out of their fight and say, well, Usyk or Fury has to beat me to be undisputed. Usyk has already beaten Joshua twice, and he's already beaten Dubois. But let's say Fury wins, he should still be considered the undisputed champion, and then I think he would fight. Let's just say Joshua wins, we'd finally get that fight, right? We'd finally get Fury, Joshua, hopefully at Wembley Stadium or somewhere like that in England. So the other thing I would say is that while I'm commending the IBF, which is based here in New Jersey and has done a fairly good job of sticking to its rules over the course of the last several years, the four-belt system is idiotic and should not exist. All it does is confuse people who don't really follow boxing as closely like people like you and I do. It infuriates people. It turns people off. They don't know who the champions are. It's a huge part of the sport's problem, and I wish it didn't exist, but we do have to deal with it because the system has been in place for decades and isn't going anywhere.
You would like to see more of a UFC style model, Keith?
I don't know how they could go about it at this point, because they've been dealing, all these fighters and promoters and managers have been dealing with these sanctioning organizations for so long. I mean, ideally, of course, you would have one champion. You would have one heavyweight champion, one light heavyweight, one cruiserweight, and so on and so on and so on. But the sport is such a mess right now. I mean, how would you get the IBF to just go away, or the WBA, or there's not enough money to make those. And since it's been an accepted practice for so long, I don't know how you fix it at this point, because everyone's in it for their own self-interest. So if you have the IBF title, you're going to advocate for the IBF. Same goes for the WBA, WBC, WBO, because there was, when I first started covering boxing, the WBO title was not really considered a legitimate title. There were guys who had those titles. Guys like Joe Calzaghe, Vladimir Klitschko had the WBO heavyweight title. There were guys who had these WBO belts, but they weren't held as in high regard. And boy, I should probably put high regard in air quotes. But as the IBF, WBA, and WBC, which have all had throughout the courses of their own histories, a lot of problems. But then the WBO eventually became as recognized as the other three. And, yada, 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 here we are. And some people want the IBO to be recognized because the IBO has computerized rankings, and it's not based, they consider the rankings less subjective than the other four rankings. And then people say the Ring magazine title is the only one, although it's owned by a promoter and a former fighter. And it's, it's all part of the nonsense that we deal with in boxing, but I don't see it changing, unfortunately.
Do you remember the WBF and the IBA?
I sure do. Yeah, they would have those title fights on like ESPN or what. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think Roy Jones fought for one of those WBF titles because no one loved titles more than Roy Jones. And I think once upon a time he fought for a it was after he started losing, but I think he eventually did. Yeah.
I think Ricky Hatton held the WBF for quite a while as well.
There you go. Yeah. There's
Well,
only one Hatton.
yeah, moving on to the last one of the Saudi card. Willie Hutchinson moved to 18-1 with a unanimous decision 12 win over Craig Richards, who dropped to 18-4-1. This was also for a WBC Silver Light Heavyweight Championship. Good breakout performance, in my opinion, for Willie Hutchinson. I thought Craig Richards was going to be too experienced, kind of old man him, because obviously we'd seen Willie Hutchinson lose previously to Lennox Clark from the UK by knockout. But he has now moved up to light heavyweight, which everyone says could be the reason that we've seen more of the performance that we expected, because when he hit the pro ranks, he came with some quite fanfare and everyone was saying how good he is, you know, what they were expecting. So I'm maybe boiling himself down to 168 was just too much.
Yeah, that could be. And, you learn from losses and when people give up on a guy, sometimes that motivates him to become a different fighter, a more motivated fighter, a better fighter. And, going into this fight, I think most people thought, the odds makers and a lot of supposed experts thought that Craig Richards was going to win. So it was a really good win for him. And, obviously puts him in a position to get bigger fights. And there are, despite that the titles are all tied up and those guys are fighting each other, there are some very good domestic fights in the light heavyweight division that can be made for him now.
Yeah, I was seeing today they were already linking him after this one big win with the fight against Anthony Yard.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, Anthony Yard. If Callum Smith were to come back and fight, and I don't know that he's decided that necessarily. I think I remember him saying he's getting married and he's going to take some time off, and he made a lot of money to fight Beterbiev and everything. But there are real fights in the light heavyweight division. Boazzi, there's guys that for him to fight. So and fights that would really interest the fans in the UK. So good for him. I mean, the guy turned his career around on Saturday, and that's what that's all about, right? I mean, guys taking risks and being rewarded for those risks panning out.
Kind of a random question, but we've spoken about the Smith brothers a couple of times tonight. Can you name another family, Keith, that had 4 brothers that fought?
I don't 4. Wow, that's a lot, man. 4.
You got Steve.
Jaron Ennis comes from 3. That's not 4, but 3.
The Gary Russell brothers, is that 3?
I'm trying to. So we got Gary Antoine Russell, Gary Antonio Russell, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. One of his, I hate to bring this up, but one of his brothers would have been a professional fighter, but he was murdered when he was a teenager. He was they all say that he was, I can't remember his first name now. I'm sorry about that. But Gary Russell Jr. has said that his brother, who was murdered in cold blood, he's point blank range, was shot to the head. I think he was only 17 or 18 years old. He was very young, but that he was the most talented of the whole family.
Well,
because he was already a decorated amateur at that point. They thought he was going to fight in the Olympics, and then that tragedy happened. I'm trying to remember. Was there another? Yeah, I get the ones that I'm thinking of. I just get to 3. So yeah. Imagine being their mother, having 4 kids. They're always fighting, and of course you don't want your kids to box for a living, and then every month one of them is fighting pretty much on their way up, and you have to worry about that,
Right. So Keith, just rate that card overall, the Saudi card. What kind of rating would you give that?
Well, it was entirely too long. I would say that the pace of the card was too slow. I think I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to, build up the fights between fights with all the interviews and all that kind of stuff. But they need to tighten that up, because you're getting a lot of value for your money. But I don't think that even the most devout boxing fans want to invest 6 or 7 hours in a given day to a card. And that's basically what it was, because it started on American television, started at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and it didn't end until, I don't know, 8:40, 8:45, something like that Eastern. So it's between 6.5 and 7 hours. And while you got a lot of value for 40, it was in US. I know in the UK it's obviously cheaper, and if you ask them to pay £39.99, they would laugh in your face probably. Not probably, they would laugh in your face. But $39.99, based on what's happened here in the United States over the course of the last 30 years, is considered a bargain. And you did get a lot of competitive fights and entertaining fights for your $40. In comparison, I think we're going to talk about this briefly coming up. The card headlined by Adrien Broner and Blair Cobbs on Saturday in Florida also cost $39.99. So that gives you an idea of how much value you actually got from this card in Saudi Arabia.
We didn't even plan that, and a great transition there, Keith. So, fight previews Friday night fights, Friday the 7th of June.
Oh, Friday, my mistake. I'm trying to forget that it's happening at all, let alone which day, but yeah.
From the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino, Hollywood, Florida, on ThrillerTV.com. Adrien Broner, The Problem, 35-4-1, goes up against Blair the Flair Klobbs, 16-1-1. So if Broner shows up, and the press release for this fight even stated that itself, if Adrien Broner shows up, what can we expect, Keith? What can we expect?
I think it'll be the main event will be a competitive fight. Based on where Adrien Broner is in his career and the fact that he hasn't fought someone who's even like a top 25 welterweight in forever. So it could be a competitive fight. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Blair Cobbs won, because who knows what to make of Adrien Broner at this point. Not only from a mental standpoint, but from a physical standpoint, because he's going on 35 years old. So, and this is not the Adrien Broner who, could kind of make people believe that he was still going to become something that he never became. That's over with now. So that's why he's fighting on a Don King card on a Friday night, because people don't believe in Adrien Broner anymore, and they haven't for quite some time. So it could wind up being about entertainment. Maybe I shouldn't say entertaining. It could wind up being a competitive fight. Blair Cobbs, he hasn't fought in quite some time either. He had a good win against Maurice Hooker, but Maurice Hooker was a diminished product at that point, and that was almost 2 years ago. So Cobbs is coming off a very long layoff. The question I would have primarily, Michael, about this fight is, what does it really do for the winner? Now, it does more for Cobbs if he wins than it does for Adrien Broner, just because Adrien Broner is a big name. But it's not like if Blair Cobbs wins this fight, people are going to say, oh, he should fight Jaron Ennis, or he should fight so-and-so, all names that he's called out rather ridiculously over the course of the last few years. But I don't know, for $40, like even if you love boxing, you really, really love boxing, you're going to pay $40 to see this? Not you specifically, I just mean anyone.
Yeah, no, that's the problem. But like you said, in the US, we're so used to being charged, $80, $100, that, like you said, in our minds now, we're like, oh, that's a bargain.
Well, Saturday was a bargain. That I'll say, because you got some real value for your money there with the competitive matchups and the big names, Deontay Wilder and Bivol and other guys that were on the card. But what are you getting here?
Right, because even the other names.
I really don't know I don't know how to answer that, because you never know what to make of Adrien Broner.
Yeah, and the other names on the card, you've got Michael Hunter against Cassius Chaney, and
that's actually I would say that's an interesting fight. If you've seen Cassius Chaney come up and not really reach the heights that some people thought that he was going to reach, because Michael Hunter's very good, and this is a tough opponent for Cassius Chaney, but that could wind up being a competitive fight. Still doesn't warrant the $40 price tag, but at least it's a reasonably competitive fight on the undercard.
Looking at Broner's career, Keith, this is a hard one. Did he overachieve or underachieve?
Well, that depends on who you were listening to or what you were watching, I guess, because from what we were watching, well, what was he? I mean, no one who watched him thought that he was going to become the next Floyd Mayweather or whomever. So in that way, you would say maybe he overachieved a little bit because he was a great salesman and he constantly convinced people that he could beat people that he had no chance to beat. Maidana, beat whatever aura Adrien Broner had out of him 10 and a half years ago. It was a very long time ago. He had no business whatsoever getting that payday against Pacquiao in 2019. Look at some of the fights that that there are people who think he lost to Adrian Granados, who's a tough kid, not really a welterweight. People think he lost that fight. So there have been a lot of instances over the years where he's disappointed. The Mikey Garcia fight wasn't even competitive, really. So there's been a lot of missed opportunities for him. The Sean Porter fight wasn't a bad performance by Broner. He knocked Sean Porter down, but lost. So, he's just one of those guys. I mean, he's a polarizing guy because he's said a lot of crazy things and posted a lot of wacky videos on social media. And just as a human being, there are points when even if you don't really care for his antics, you'd have to be concerned about his well-being. He has a lot of children and everything, and you wouldn't want to see someone do any harm to themselves. But it seemed several times that he was in a bad place mentally, and you had to worry if he was going to harm himself. And no laughing matter, of course, and no one would ever want to see that happen to anyone. So, so he's a complicated figure in boxing, but I just think that they've just had it with him at this point. I mean, enough is enough. I mean, he's, again, going on 35 years old. No one would, in their right mind, would say that he's still going to do anything in this sport, really. So I don't really understand what Don King is doing here in terms of continuing to build these cards around Adrien Broner, but it's not my money.
Because on paper, he's a 4-weight world champion.
I think that takes us back to our conversation about the absurdity of the 4-belt system, does it not? Interim titles and the like,
I think I'm right in saying none of them, they were all vacant, right?
Yeah, vacant titles, interim titles, it's all, Yeah, but I guess he could. I don't think he actually has a paper resume like most people do, but if he did, he could technically put on there that he was a 4-weight world champion. That is accurate.
Can you remember when he hit the scene, Keith, and all the fanfare? And
yeah,
can you just describe what people thought? Because I remember there was a section of fans who thought he's going to be the next Mayweather. Then everyone else, I think, just realized that he was kind of like just a salesman, essentially.
Yeah, and that's the way he was marketed, as the next Mayweather. Like, he was one of Floyd's proteges, and he was fighting on HBO. And Michael, you remember the reach that HBO had once upon a time. There were not, a few 100,000 people watching these fights. There were over 1 million people watching regularly. So he got great exposure. Being affiliated with Floyd in any capacity is going to do wonders for anyone's career at that point. Floyd was the number 1 pound for pound fighter in the world, and he was a superstar making crazy money. He didn't fight like Floyd Mayweather, but I mean, stylistically even. But people did believe it for a while because it was just said by, I don't want to say everyone, but that was the marketing campaign that was built around Adrien Broner, that he was going to be the next Mayweather. And then he took the fight against Maidana, and I think in some ways he might have did more positive for his reputation in the way that he lost to Maidana than he did with any of the fights that he won, because he got beat up in that fight, but he kept getting up, and he didn't quit in any way. And I think he in some ways took his beating like a man, and I think people respected him for that, despite that he had a big mouth and that he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I think people respected the way that he went out on his shield, I guess, against a really rugged guy who wound up giving Mayweather some trouble later on.
Yeah. Interesting. It'd be interesting to see if he even shows up for Thursday, Friday for the fight. So it's going to be interesting, to see what Don King does, because, like you said, have people had enough of him? Are people going to tune in? Are people going to pay the $40?
Yeah. I think he'll show up this, he hasn't fought in just about a year. Um, it's not like he's working a job somewhere in between fights or anything. So I'm assuming he needs money. So I think he'll show up. What weight he'll be when he shows up is anyone's guess, but I would expect the event to move forward because Blair Cobbs hasn't fought, as I said, in almost 2 years as well. So even if Broner comes in a little overweight or wants the contract weight changed on Wednesday or something like that, I think that Blair Cobbs would do it because he's not going to pull out of the fight and waste a training camp.
Yeah, and you probably know, okay, like Broner's on the slide. If I manage to get this name on my ledger, it's going to be beautiful for me.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying before that this, if Blair Cobbs wins, it does a lot more for him than it does for Broner if he wins. If Broner wins, well, yeah, he's better than his last opponent. That's not saying a whole lot, but who's Blair Cobbs exactly? That he's a guy who's on social media has said a lot of crazy things, and he's a colorful character, no doubt about it. But and that was a good win that he got against Maurice Hooker. But it's not like he's some former world champion or ascending contender or anything like that.
Yeah. So moving on to news and notes, the upcoming boxing match between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson for July 20th has been postponed. Tyson experienced a health issue on a flight from Los Angeles to Miami that required medical attention Sunday. Are you a fan of this fight, Keith? Obviously 57-year-old Mike Tyson getting in there with someone nearly 30 years younger than him.
Well, not really. I understand the appeal, the crossover appeals. People still love Mike Tyson. When Mike Tyson enters a venue, no one gets the roar of the crowd like he does, and I mean no one. And then Michael, you're at some of the fights. You see the very famous people outside of boxing that show up. No one gets the reaction that Mike Tyson gets. So there are a lot of people who want to see him turn back the clock and knock Jake Paul's block off in this fight. He's 30 years younger than him, a brash guy. I hope it doesn't set any kind of precedent. I hope this doesn't become the norm where guys in their mid-20s are fighting guys in their mid-50s. It's kind of ridiculous, but Tyson can punch. But I would just remind people, not that people who follow boxing need this reminder, but the last time Mike Tyson was in any kind of real fight, not when he went on that tour after he retired or the Roy Jones thing. I mean a real fight. He quit against Kevin McBride, and that was 19 years ago. So I don't know why they're expecting the Mike Tyson of 1990 to show up whenever this fight is rescheduled, but I wouldn't count on that. I'd say a 57-year-old guy is bad enough. A 57-year-old guy who had a medical emergency on a flight. I'm not sure that that's someone who should be licensed to fight, but money talks oftentimes, and I think they'll reschedule this fight, and it'll get a lot of attention. I don't really have a problem with the attention that it's getting because whatever people are interested in, that's up to them. If people want to, and plus people don't have to pay. If you pay whatever it is for your, some people have different plans with Netflix, with $11 or $16 or whatever it might be per month. You don't have to pay any extra to see this. So it's not like they're gouging you for $90 or $80 or whatever. It's part of your Netflix subscription. So no harm, no foul there. You just really hope, all criticism aside, that whenever this fight does take place, that Mike Tyson leaves the ring healthy, because it's not normal for a 57-year-old, probably 58 years old when the fight happens. It's not normal for that. Say whatever you will about Jake Paul being a cruiserweight and inexperienced and never having fought someone who punches like Mike Tyson. That's all true, but he is 26, 27 years old, and he's a strong, big, strong kid. And this guy's almost 60. So, he's not your ordinary 60-year-old. I'll grant you that, but he's almost 60.
What's your views
and
on?
He was in, I'm sorry to cut you off, but in some ways was essentially shot when he was 30.
Yeah. What's your views on Netflix getting into the business, Keith?
It's good for boxing if they stay in boxing in a meaningful way, and I don't know that they will, but they do seem to be branching out into live sporting events. They're going to have 2 NFL games on Christmas Day. Boxing is a niche sport. It's not the monster that the NFL is, but if they want to spend some money in any real way in boxing, that can't hurt the business. The more entities that are involved and have some money to spend on fights, I mean, the more the merrier. So, and when you get these big brand names like Netflix and Prime Video, when you get those kind of companies involved in boxing, it can't hurt.
Do you think Amazon's going to stay in the boxing business? We haven't really seen much of a schedule from them and PBC.
I don't know. I based on what I've seen so far, I'm not optimistic. They haven't really done much in terms of marketing these fights, and there has not been a Prime Video fight card scheduled yet. That's just strictly on Prime Video. They have shown some undercard fights before the pay-per-view start, but that's pretty much it. And if you're not a hardcore boxing fan and you know when all the fights are and you read the websites and the Twitter and this and that, if you just went on Prime Video, you wouldn't know there's any boxing on there at all, because it's not promoted well. It's not placed prominently on the app to find it. So even on the day of the fight, excuse me, Michael, I know it's there. Of course, I'm looking for it, and I was covering some of the fights off of TV or whatever. But you got to search for it. It's not like it's prominently displayed. So I think it's not a priority for them, and not that we expected it to be a priority for a company of that magnitude, but I would have liked to have seen a little bit more marketing from them and a little bit more of a partnership between them and PBC in terms of letting people know about these fights. Gervonta Davis is fighting Frank Martin next week, and we're getting the usual PR push that we get from the boxing companies, but I don't see Prime Video doing a whole lot to promote. Gervonta Davis is one of the biggest stars in American boxing, him and Canelo. And I don't really see them going out of their way to really promote this event. It's a solid fight against Frank Martin. I would expect Gervonta Davis to win, but David Benavidez is on the undercard. I mean, there's some real fighters on there and guys that should be prominently displayed, and they're just not getting that push. I don't know how much marketing money is being spent by Amazon, but it's whatever it is. I just wish they would do more.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. Hopefully Amazon and Netflix stay in it, but Amazon hasn't got off to a good start. But Keith, I appreciate you giving me an hour and a half of your night. I know it's getting late over on the East Coast. If you want to just tell everyone where they can find your news, where they can find you on your social media handles.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is just my last name. It's at Idec Boxing, IDEC Boxing. You can read me at on Boxing News' website for now, and soon enough I'll have an announcement about my next full-time stop. Unfortunately, can't discuss it just quite yet, but soon enough.
You can find us at The Last Round 12 on Instagram and Twitter. Be sure to join us next time. This is The Last Round.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is The Last Round Podcast.